Let's begin with a word of prayer together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable and pleasing to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Joseph. Who is this Joseph person we hear in the Gospel of Matthew? And there's lots of traditions that tell us something about Joseph, but what does Matthew specifically tell us about Joseph? One of the things we get in the passage that Kathy reflected on to us was when the angel spoke to Joseph, doesn't just call him Joseph, calls him Joseph, son of David. And if we were to go back to the earliest verses, which is not much before verse 18 in chapter 1, we look at the first 17 verses, is the genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew. We have an interesting genealogy in Matthew. There are women listed in the genealogy, which was not typical of the day. And toward the end of that genealogy, we have the naming of Joseph as part of that lineage that leads to the gift of Jesus in the world. And so we have Joseph as this individual that comes from this lineage of David, the great king of Jewish history. We have Joseph, who is a person of strong moral character and good values. He wants to make good ethical decisions about his life and his future. And yet here we find Joseph in this opening chapter at a crossroads. He's told something about the relationship with Mary that's very troubling to him. Now, we could go down kind of a side path and deal with all the dynamics of Mary and the birth process, but Matthew really wants to focus on the relationship of Joseph itself and what Joseph does in this process. Now, this crossroads that Joseph finds himself in is probably no different than crossroads we have found ourselves in. We try to sometimes think, well, Joseph had this unique story that's different than mine. But I want to argue and maybe make a point today in the message that Joseph's crossroads might be similar to those crossroads we encounter at different stages of our life. I'm going to give you two historical crossroads moments. One is in 1809. That's going way back a few years. There's a gentleman by the name of Alexander Campbell, one of the founders of the Christ Church Disciples of Christ. And in 1809, we would find him in Glasgow, Scotland, finishing up his training, his degree in ministry. And in the particular Presbyterian church of which he was a part, one of his goals in that training would be able to recite certain questions about his faith and his beliefs within the Presbyterian church, that when it came time to take communion, that if he recited all the right questions and did all the right things, that he would present his little token that says, I am worthy to take communion. He goes to the training. And the lore of the story is that he's on his way from his school to the church for worship and to take communion. Is in that journey between those two buildings, he passes by a gentleman that is unhoused and has nowhere to stay on the side of the road and is begging for something to eat as he's walking to making his way to church. And he passes him by with the others that had been in their training and just passed by the gentleman and made their way into church. He gets to the communion table and he's received his token of being worthy of communion. And Alexander found himself at a crossroads. I've done all the right things. I'm ready to take communion. But he couldn't get the man on the street out of his mind. What makes me any more worthy to take communion than this gentleman on the side of the street that could benefit from the same gift that I could receive at the table? Alexander wanted to do the right thing. But in that moment, he tosses his token on the table and walks out and leaves the church of his origin, deciding that a different kind of church is what needs to be started. Fast forward to 1955, December of that year, right in the heart of race relations in this country, here in the United States. And in December of 1955, Rosa Parks loads up on the bus, sits down, and at some point the bus driver comes over to her and says, "I need you to move to make room for a white person." And she refuses to budge from her seat. Many of us know many parts of that story. She was a part of a larger movement of the Montgomery bus boycott that was happening. Rosa Parks became almost the first lady of the civil rights, some people would call her. And she was a member of the Montgomery NAACP at the time. And she was a part of this organization to help make visible to the rest of the country the discrepancies of race. Now, Rosa wanted to do all the right things. She could follow all the rules. She could follow all the societal measures of what you do and what you don't do. But at some point and in some time in December of 1955, she finally decided, no, the right thing isn't necessarily what's the accepted thing in society. We all have times and places, and I've picked out maybe some higher visible individuals that were at moments that would be considered crossroad moments of their life, and they had to make a decision. Do I follow down the path that was in front of me that others thought I would do, or do I choose a different path for my life? It's interesting as think about the story of Joseph, and he's got this dynamic with Mary, and he's trying to figure things out, and yet we realize that Joseph does not make this decision in isolation. Joseph has a visitor, an angel. And the angel comes to Joseph in a dream. In the dream, the angel offers an alternative to what he thinks is the only path forward, which is divorce and separation, trying not to shame Mary, all those pieces we hear in the passage. And the angel said, there is an alternate way to do this, an honorable way to do this, a way that reflects the love of God and this gift that is coming into the world. And Joseph wakes from the dream and chooses maybe the more difficult path, but a path that speaks to his heart. You know, Matthew was written probably 70, 80 AD, probably, decades actually after the birth of Jesus. It's interesting when I think about it, the context of the Gospel of Matthew, as the author of Matthew is writing this gospel, that those that are trying to lean into this new way of what we call the way of Jesus, the Jesus movement, that those followers of Jesus were at a similar crossroads in their own faith. Many in the Gospel of Matthew would have had Jewish heritage. Oftentimes the Matthew Gospel is called the Jewish Gospel. It's the most Jewish of the four Gospels we have in the New Testament. And so the audience is primarily a Jewish heritage audience that are part of this Matthean church community. And they themselves are struggling with, how do I honor my Jewish heritage and still follow Jesus? How do I do this? I want to follow all the laws of which I've been a part, but I also believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I believe Jesus is the one that shows us an alternative and more faithful path in the world. And the Gospel of Matthew is trying to help through angels and Joseph to help those people in that Matthean community understand that there is an alternative path to honor your past and yet forge forward in a way forward that honors where you are in the moment and the things you're discerning about in your own crossroads of faith. You know, the Jesus way is as simple as we like to make it, is fraught with all kinds of complexities. Our life would be much simpler and says, well, what does the Bible say specifically about this? And oftentimes the Bible does not give direct answers to all the complexities of our life. We sure would like it to be an answer book. But it's more a book of guidance and discernment. It's a community book. It's not like, well, I'm going to flip open the Bible and point my finger and that will be my answer for the day. Recognize the Jesus way is a hard path. There are those that have been reared in the church from the very beginning, and they get to a certain point that says, and they just kind of fall away from church altogether. How many in our society and world have been reared in this tradition, and somehow they've kind of drifted away from the faith in one way or another, trying to figure out their life. And there are others that have come from either no faith background or an alternate faith background, and somehow began doing some of the readings about Jesus and about the Christian faith, and they found their way in trying to honor the tradition where they've come from and lean into a new tradition in which they find value and strength. And then there are those within the Christian faith that have been a part of the faith their whole life and sometimes take for granted the complexities of life within the own tradition, that maybe I've learned enough. Recognizing that our crossroads of faith is, regardless of what I've learned, I have far more to learn than I've already learned about my life. Joseph reminds us in this sequence in chapter 1 of learning about Mary's pregnancy, discerning about his own decisions forward, recognizing that there's an alternative path to recognize that something God is doing is bigger than just me. And I need to pay attention to all that is going on around me to help me discern decision-making in my life. One of the things that we find in this passage is the infamous word of Emmanuel, a name of which Jesus is also called, which is, as we know, translated God with us. One of the things I see in the person of Joseph is that when Joseph embraces the journey of Mary and the arrival of Jesus, Joseph is embracing a journey that says God is with us, even in the most difficult, hard moments of our life. Well, who was Joseph? Well, he was a man of Jewish lineage. He was the person that had a woman he was engaged to. He was a person of moral and value integrity. He was a person that tried to make the right ethical decisions. He was a person at a crossroads. Joseph is you and me. And sometimes we need one another. And we need to lean into God's presence to help us make our decisions when decisions are to be made. And we are discerning those complexities of life around us. We have to remember that God truly is with us, like God was with Joseph, and God was with Mary, and God gifted us the gift of Jesus. That God has never left us. God is always with us. And on this day in which we light a candle of peace, as difficult as life may be, as difficult, and we have this candle of joy, reminding us that life is meant to be shared in exuberance around other people. God is with us. God is with you, and God is with me, and God is with those outside of this church longing and hungering for community to be whole and just and right. In some weird and unusual way, The decisions that Joseph was making about his life was actually helping us make our own discernments about life. Joseph truly does show us the way to Bethlehem, and for him, I am grateful. Amen.